And we are recording. Hey, Michael, how are you?
Hello, very good, thanks, Aaron.
Um, we met in London about a month ago. I was in London a month ago. We had a beer with
We
some
did.
other Bitcoiners, and in retrospect, that was like the last normal day of my life, if I think back, because the next day I flew home and I went through, I don't know, one of the airports, Gatwick or Heathrow, whatever it was, and I was seeing some people with like face masks, and I had to touch like the bins where you put your phone in and like all your stuff, and I knew like these are hotspots for viruses and bacteria. And I think at that point I started to think a little bit about this corona thing. It was already in England as well. It was on the news a lot, and that's sort of the day I started to think about, okay, what's actually going on, and should I care about this more than I am right now. And then I went, when I start to care about something, or at least something I find interesting, I go on like some kind of crazy news binge, and that's sort of what I've been doing since then. So we had a beer. That was the last normal day of my life, and since then it's all about my corona obsession started.
Well, I hope we treated you well enough so that it was good memories
Yeah, it was.
before your new life started.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, hey, why don't you talk me through what has been happening in England? You're in London. You're in England.
Mhm.
What has been happening in London, England, kind of since I left, or even before then? Like, what has been the English Corona strategy?
So I suspect today it's pretty similar around most countries, but early on in the UK we had we had the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who's now got the coronavirus.
He's got the
Um,
coronavirus, and also your half your royalty's got the coronavirus, right?
I don't know if it's half. Prince Charles has, or at least, I mean, obviously, don't trust verify. Like I can't verify it, but according to the media, all of those people do have it. But very early on, I was really concerned because we had one of the head scientific advisors to the government on TV with the Prime Minister talking about a strategy of herd immunity. And I think that phrase is now propagated around so that people were discussing that phrase, and I think that was originated. I mean, people have discussed that before, but I think discussion of that with relation to corona was propagated potentially from this scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, in the UK. And at that point, I was very worried because it seemed as if we were going to diverge from the rest of the world, and we were going to not do anything, let the virus spread, and just see what happens. Um, we've rode back on that now, thankfully, at least in my opinion, so that the measures that we have in place now, I think, are pretty standard across all countries at this stage in the evolution of this virus spreading.
Yeah, I've already discussed this herd immunity idea with Shores, for example, in my episode with him. But maybe we can do a quick recap of what this actually means and what the idea behind it was.
Okay, yeah. So I think everyone's familiar with immunity. Like you often with diseases or viruses that have been around for decades, you can get the virus, or you can have a vaccination that makes you immune to that virus. And so, for viruses that we know a lot about, that strategy might make sense. We have mass vaccination programs in the UK and many other countries. So when it's something that you really understand and you've seen it spread and have cycles over various years and decades, that can make sense. But with something that you know so little about, and we only had some data emerging from like Wuhan originally in China, we don't know how accurate that data is. Then there was Italy, and similar things were happening there. And so when it's this new, you really have to apply what Nassim Taleb calls the precautionary principle, and just make sure that you're doing everything in your power to ensure that if this does get really bad, hopefully, I mean, it's already got quite bad, hopefully it won't be, I don't know, Spanish flu or plague-like precautions, but you really need to lock it down early, so that you can, so that it doesn't become out of control. And I mean, with Bitcoin, we're very familiar with the exponential curve. Like whenever Bitcoin goes through like a hype cycle and everyone starts buying Bitcoin, we see that exponential curve. And with an exponential curve, you just can't predict where the peak of that exponential curve will be. You can't predict what the peak Bitcoin price will be. You can't predict at what point or at what time you should put in restrictions so that that peak of the exponential curve isn't too high. You just can't predict. So all you can do is put early restrictions in place to try and prevent that from spreading as early as you possibly can. And so, and early, like our response was really terrible in the UK. Like in the US, Trump stopped flights from China flying in to the US. I mean, we did nothing.
Yeah, so to stick to this precautionary principle for a second,
Mm-hmm.
the general idea there is that if you're unsure how bad it's going to be, then it's better to err on the safe side than to take too much risk. Because you know, if you take too many precautions and then it turns out that it's not that bad, then
you can just relax them.
Yeah, exactly. While the other way around, it's, you know, the results can be catastrophic.
Yeah.
So why do you think, if this was so obvious to you, for example, and I tend to agree with you, why do you think governments didn't follow this reasoning? Like, what happened in the UK, for example, that they took this wait and see approach type of strategy?
I mean, we could go down a conspiratorial discussion, but to try and keep it something that most people could buy into, I assume what's happened is that the scientific advisors around Boris Johnson and the government were, it sounds like they were doing a lot of modeling. And again, we can talk about the limitations of modeling, but they were, rather than just executing really, really quickly and getting restrictions in place, they were like tweaking models and like, oh, well, where is it going to peak? And like, we don't want a second peak in winter of 2020 that was even higher than this peak. And so it's just days and days of that sort of study, rather than just doing what's really needed as soon as possible.
I think the idea is there because I have the same impression that they were making assumptions on what were the most likely parameters of the virus based on the little knowledge they had, and then they put these assumptions into their models, and they used these models to come up with a policy. But they didn't properly take into account what would happen if the assumptions were wrong, even if they were a little bit wrong, or if they were very wrong, and what the end result of that would be. Like, that wasn't sort of all taken into the calculation to come up with a strategy. And that's the type of stuff I think you'll hear Nassim Taleb say, that you gotta take into account what happens if your assumption is wrong and what the end result of that is, and then come up with a policy. I think that's sort of what we've seen happening. But I'm also very curious what would be the conspiratorial answer you mentioned. Let's hear it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to discuss it because, I mean, like, there's not enough data on like the current state of deaths and people coming out of hospitals. Like, there's just no data to back up conspiracy theories. But I mean, on the modeling side, I mean, every time you do modeling, the first thing you should do is lay out what the limitations of that model are. I mean, building a model, I mean, it uses math, and people sometimes like glorify math in this complex system type setting where it's like, oh, well, it's complex math, so it must be right. And math is great for proving things like Pythagoras' theorem, like things where there's only a small number of axioms and you can prove that that's definitely true in all cases. But as soon as you come to this complex system arena, I mean, there's just so many parameters, there's so many assumptions, like all of the variables are interacting with each other at various points, and the relationships between those variables change as something like the virus evolves. So, I mean, the first thing you should do is outline what the limitations of this model are, and also discuss and before you even start the modeling, you should be discussing, well, what are the tail risks here? Like what could potentially happen that will just make this model completely pointless and completely useless? I mean, I think George Box said, like, all models are wrong, but some are useful. They're all wrong, right? They're simplifications. They're Lego models. I don't care if you're using complex math. It's Lego. You wouldn't build a palace with Lego and say, well, if we build a palace like this Lego model, like the palace would be fine. It won't be. Like, there's so much complexity below that Lego model that you're just not taking into account if that's all you're doing in terms of planning for building a palace.
So the other suspicion I have is, and I want to hear your thoughts on that as well then, is that to take this precautionary principle does require quite a lot. It does require that you stop all flights, and you kind of have to grind the economy to a halt in a way. And I do think that grinding the economy to a halt in the economy we have, with the economy we have, which, based on compiling death, that's how you pronounce that, is a very big risk because our economy is very fragile as it is. So if, I suspect that some of the decisions were made with the idea that we can't really grind our economy to a halt because it will all come crushing down. So we kind of have to gamble on this virus not being too bad. So we'll just keep going and hope for the best. And now that has been the strategy, and now it sort of looks like hoping for the best didn't work out. Now our problem may be even bigger because now we have to grind the economy to halt after all. So now we sort of have the worst of both worlds.
And this is a lesson from like Nassim Taleb and Black Swan and Anti-Fragile is you can be faced with a threat and try and sweep it under the carpet. And most of the time, that'll be fine because it won't be as bad as people potentially worry. But the few times where it is as bad as people worry, if not worse, then you've got such a much bigger challenge than you initially had if you'd have just tried to address it early on. So, I mean, we're talking trillions of damage now, where if things were executed weeks or months ago, we could have potentially had hundreds of millions, if not billions of damage. But that's the sweeping under the carpet, that's the collecting of tail risks. And then you just need one to blow and you've got real problems. But there was certainly a lot, Trump was, when Trump closed the border to China, he was massively criticized and called racist for not allowing Chinese people into the US early on. I remember there was a story, Andreessen Horowitz, the VC in California, advised all of their employees to stop doing handshakes with people coming in for meetings. And they were hounded in the media and said they don't want to touch like riffraff or like people coming into their office with germs. So, I mean, there's huge pressure against that early on. So, I mean, I do have sympathy in terms of that. But what you don't do is have a government advisor coming onto the television and say, our strategy is herd immunity. Because then how do you convince everyone to take it seriously? How do you say to everyone, this is really important, you don't leave your homes? When a few weeks ago you were saying, oh, well, we're going for herd immunity and it'll be good if 60% of the population get it. I mean, it's crazy.
So what is the current situation in England? Are you in some sort of level of lockdown? I think you are.
Yeah. So thankfully, at least for now, we're allowed to go out to buy groceries and exercise once a day.
Yeah, so hang on, before one quick question for those who missed this. So you had this strategy of herd immunity and your government just basically completely backtracked on it. They said, all right, that's not a good idea after all, because based on the latest numbers, that would cause too many deaths and too many hospitals.
They never, I mean, that phrase was quietly ditched. Oh. So, I mean, again, I don't know what happened in the background.
Oh, the phrase herd immunity was ditched.
Yeah. They haven't discussed that since they've aligned their strategy with most other countries in the world at this point in the evolution of the virus.
Right. Yeah. So
the scientist who went on Sky News and talked about herd immunity as the strategy is still coming out and representing the government. And again, this isn't like, mean, you can't. I don't think you can criticize. I mean, Boris Johnson isn't a scientist. He's not an expert. He's not a scientist. I mean, he spent most of his life preparing for Brexit, and like he's so. I mean, you can't just blame. You can't expect someone to know everything and be an expert in everything. So he's relying on advisors. So my criticism is towards the advisors rather than politicians who you wouldn't expect to have this expertise.
Yeah, but so apparently this term of herd immunity was ditched. Same happened in the Netherlands, by the way. More or less, they didn't officially backtrack, but they just sort of seem to have changed their plan without making clear what the new plan is. And I guess something similar is happening in England because there is some sort of lockdown now.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we're not allowed to leave the house apart from groceries, exercise, or like volunteering, really urgent work, like if you work with the NHS or health services.
Is this being checked by police, or is it being enforced in some way or another?
I've seen stories online where yes, they've, I don't know, come in and closed down barbecues and things. And there was one, I saw something on Twitter where Derbyshire Police Force had got a drone in the air and were publicly shaming people that had gone to like a park to exercise. So I mean, there are legitimate concerns that like this is going to have challenges with regards to surveillance and like privacy and people's rights later on down the line. And some police forces obviously are just aren't scientists either. So I mean, they don't really understand why the advice has been given. But yeah, we haven't had sorry.
I did see photos of completely packed undergrounds in London. So that doesn't seem very helpful.
Yeah, I mean it's always like that, and apparently they've. So I mean, some so like NHS staff, which is our universal health care system. I mean, they need to be transport to get these guys to the hospitals, and apparently and this is probably the London Mayor's fault, is Sadiq Khan or someone below him. They've massively decreased the number of underground trains. So even though there's much fewer people going on the underground, there's also much fewer trains. So they're just as crowded as they were in normal times. So
And
I mean, again, I mean, you're just looking around and you're just like, this is just so crazy. Like, why are people so incompetent? And incompetence kills, like especially in dire scenarios.
And I'm sure no one's wearing masks.
No, more and more people are wearing masks. More and more supermarkets are putting in like tape to encourage people to stay 2 meters away from each other. Again, like later than they should have done, in my opinion. Like they should have done this weeks ago, but they are doing it now.
What about the situation in hospitals? I've heard it's not great at this point.
Yeah, again, I haven't seen data, but certainly some hospitals in London are already full or overflowing. Other cities, apparently, I have a friend who's in a northern city, and he says like they haven't been hit at all yet. So I think it's very city by city. London's definitely going to be the place that struggles the most. It doesn't seem as bad as in New York. London and New York are kind of comparable in terms of size. It seems like New York is having a much worse time than London currently. But yeah, London is kind of like our epicenter or like our Wuhan for the virus. So yeah, we'll see how bad it gets here, and that'll foreshadow how bad it gets in other parts of the country, I suspect.
Yeah, I did hear Boris Johnson put out a call for volunteers to help the NHS.
Yeah.
And massive amounts of people.
Yeah.
So what are they volunteering for, or what's the story there?
Yeah, so yeah, I think 600,000 people have volunteered, which is incredible. Like our population is 66 million, so 600,000 of those people volunteering is amazing. I don't know how they'll be managed, and I don't know like how much competence there will be in terms of putting that volunteer force to work. But like they've been encouraged to volunteer to either make phone calls to old and vulnerable people who are potentially stranded and are going to be struggling for food and supplies, especially if they have symptoms. Obviously, the NHS or health system needs more volunteers. They're setting up like hospitals in arenas and morgues in airports and things. Just transporting food around and supplies and things like this. So, I mean, there's lots of things volunteers can help with. But yeah, I mean, it needs to be managed. I don't know. I have no idea how effectively it's going to be managed. It doesn't help, obviously, that our Prime Minister and our Health Secretary and one of the scientific advisors is probably doing more harm than good, but like they've all got corona now, and so they're self-isolating.
I heard something about the British government getting emergency powers or something along these lines.
Yeah, I think a lot of governments have. They've certainly had to put in legislation to allow like police to enforce or fine people who aren't following government advice. So like the government can't just put out advice and say, please follow it. And then the police have freedom to punish people that don't follow the advice. So there's various legislation they've put in place. I haven't looked into it, but
yeah, I think there isn't a square meter in all of England that isn't monitored by CCTV.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's an argument that surveillance can't get any worse in terms of like physical surveillance. There can't be any more cameras put up. But certainly in terms of like monitoring communications, or I was reading like the Taiwanese government is monitoring all movement of citizens with their phones and things like this.
Is that kind of
stuff? There are a lot of, I don't know.
Are they discussing it? Is it an issue? Because it's happening in some Western countries as well now. It's happening in Italy, it's happening in Israel, where they're using this GPS to see if people actually stay at home.
But it seems like, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like during these crises, like emergency powers are granted, and there's not too much transparency around how they're using those powers. Just because the rationale for that is that there's bigger concerns to worry about. So we'll just give you free rein to do everything in your power to stop the spread of the disease. But I mean, surveillance. Like, I mean, there's a lot of people on Twitter. I think Francis Puyol, Bull Bitcoin CEO in Canada, is like really anti this precautionary principle type thing, and saying like all these downsides, obviously the economic downside and surveillance downside. Surveillance is what I'm worried about longer term. I don't think, I mean, after the plague, the effective government didn't stop people from leaving their house for the next for centuries afterwards, right? So, I mean, things will get back to normal eventually in terms of our ability to leave our houses and congregate in big crowds. And go to nightclubs and bars and things. Like, this isn't going to be a lasting impact. But surveillance, it just creeps in time and time again, and it never gets rolled back. So I think surveillance is a concern. I don't think police enforcing people staying in their homes is a long-term concern, because it's just not viable, and there's business owners that would have their businesses go bankrupt if that was a permanent state of affairs.
Well, have they in England given you some sort of mid to long-term vision on what this is going to look like? In the Netherlands, they've basically said they've said out loud, they don't have a mid to long-term strategy at this point, which is kind of baffling. That, I mean, they're at least honest about it, but right now they're saying, okay, this is the plan for the next couple of weeks, and then we'll see. Like, we'll look at the data and then we'll come up with the next step. Is that the same in England, or have they communicated some sort of plan of how long people are supposed to stay at home, or what?
They haven't communicated that, but I just think that's impossible to do. So, I mean, I don't have any criticism in that regard. Like, we just don't know, like where like when the peak will be in terms of like peak numbers in hospital and peak numbers of people dying. I mean, the thing to really monitor, I think, for all of us, I mean, if there's anything we will monitor, is whether there's if, because I mean Wuhan's starting to relax their restrictions now in China. Like if they start to get more cases, or people start getting reinfected for a second time, that's really worrying, because then this could potentially be many months, if not years. So I think, I mean, until we know more and we see what the end game is for places like Wuhan that are a lot earlier than us, you just can't make any medium or long-term plans, I don't think.
What are your short-term plans? What are you gonna do the next couple of weeks?
Well, I mean, there's so much Bitcoin stuff to do, and so I'm just going to be doing Bitcoin stuff. Like I write some. Yeah, go for it.
What is Bitcoin stuff? What should Bitcoiners be doing now?
I mean, there's just so many things. So, like, I mean, the advice really should be try to minimize following all the panic. Like, I mean, all you can do, like as a sovereign individual, is protect yourself, protect your family, and then after that, you can't do anything in terms of, like, there's very little you can do in terms of what the government does. There's very little you can do if lots and lots of people are dying and struggling. But once you've done everything to protect yourself and your family, then I think the only thing to do is to focus on building long-term skills and long-term expertise and preparing for the world when we come out of this. And whether that's like learning to code, whether that's installing a full node, whether that's playing around with Lightning implementations, whether that's doing transcripts for previous like Bitcoin talks that are online. There's so many videos online. Bitcoin Core PR Review Club that John Newbury started to learn about Bitcoin Core. I mean, there's just so much stuff to do. So like, I mean, I'm keeping half an eye on what's going on just in case things do really get bad, and then perhaps I need to make some adjustments in terms of like whether I can go out or not, or whether I can go out and buy groceries or things like this. But apart from that, there's so much Bitcoin stuff to do.
In general, there probably isn't much change in lifestyle for most Bitcoiners anyway. If they don't follow the news, they might not even notice any difference.
Yeah, and I generally try to like not follow like media and news and politics because it just eats away at time, and then you look back and you think, well, what did I actually gain from spending all that time following it? But yeah, like unless you're volunteering, unless like you actually work in the healthcare system, or you're needing to care for family or friends or neighbors, like unless you have to do that stuff, you just got free time. And so anything that you wish you could have expertise in, or you could be doing better, this is the perfect time in your life to address that and do the things that you wish you'd had time to do before.
Awesome. All right, I think we're about half an hour in. That's more or less how long I want an episode to be. So, Michael, thanks a lot.
No worries. Good to see you, Ryan.
Stay healthy. Thanks for your time. Cheers.
No worries. See ya.